There's a specific sentence someone said to me that I still think about years later, more often than I probably should. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody yelled it. Nobody meant it as some kind of turning point when they said it. It was just a plain, quiet observation, the kind of thing said almost in passing by someone whose job is to notice things the person in front of them has stopped noticing about themselves, and it landed in me like a stone dropped into still water, sending out ripples that took months to fully reach the edges. Before I tell you what that sentence was, before I go any further, if you're new here, welcome, and if any part of what I've said so far already sounds like something you needed to hear, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because I don't want you to lose track of this channel before we get to the part of the story that actually matters most. I say that not because I need the number to go up for its own sake, though of course that helps keep this going, but because I've heard from enough people by now to know that these stories tend to find the people who need them at exactly the moment they need them, sometimes long after they first subscribed, scrolling back through late at night during a hard stretch, looking for something that says plainly, "You are not the only person who has felt this way. If that ends up being you someday, I want to make sure this is easy to find again." So take care of that now. It takes 2 seconds, and then let's keep going, because there's quite a bit more to this story, and I don't think the version I've told you so far does justice to where it actually ends up. I want to set the scene a little, because I don't think it lands the same way without context. For a long stretch of time before that conversation, I'd been living a life that looked, from any reasonable outside vantage point, completely fine. I got up, I did things, I talked to people. Nothing about my days would have alarmed anyone watching from a distance. But underneath the ordinary rhythm of it, something had gone quiet in a way I hadn't fully clocked myself. Not until someone else said it out loud and I had no good answer waiting. That's often how it goes, I think. We can get remarkably good at hiding the truth of how we're doing, not just from other people but from ourselves, right up until someone asks the one question we haven't prepared an answer for. And the silence that follows tells us more than we wanted to know. I didn't have a good answer that day. I gave the automatic one, the one I'd apparently been giving for a while without noticing how automatic it had become, and the person across from me didn't push, didn't lecture, just let the sentence sit there in the space between us. It sat with me for weeks afterward, showing up uninvited at odd moments, doing chores, lying awake, standing in line somewhere ordinary, the way a true thing tends to do once it's finally been said out loud instead of just carried around silently. I want to tell you what I did with that sentence and where it eventually led me, because I think there's a real chance you're carrying around a version of it yourself right now, something someone said to you recently, or maybe a while ago, that you haven't quite let yourself sit with yet. If that's you, I hope this gives you something useful. And if you want the rest of it, go ahead and hit subscribe, because this is very much a story in parts, and I think you'll want to see where it goes from here. I want you to picture something for me. You spend 40 years paying into a system, 40 years of national insurance contributions, 40 years of income tax, 40 years of believing, the way you're told to believe from the moment you enter the workforce, that the contract is real, that what you put in will be there waiting for you at the other end. And then you reach the other end, and you do the arithmetic, and you sit there at your kitchen table in a house that costs 4 times what it used to cost to heat, and you work out that your state pension, the thing you contributed toward for 4 decades of your working life, covers approximately 3 weeks of your actual expenses. 3 weeks. And then, because you are the kind of person who does the full calculation once you've started, you look up what that same pension would buy you somewhere else entirely. And the number you find doesn't make sense at first, so you check it again. And then you sit with it for a long time, quietly, because it changes things. It changes quite a lot of things, actually. My name is Gerald. I'm 68 years old. I was born in Birmingham. I worked in engineering for most of my adult life, and about 14 months ago, I did something that most people in my life thought was either very brave or very foolish, and I suspect the honest answer is that it was both, in roughly equal measure. I moved to the Philippines. And before I tell you what I found when I got there, and what it cost, and what it didn't cost, and why I genuinely believe the arithmetic alone should be a matter of public conversation rather than something people only stumble onto quietly in the corner of the internet, go ahead and subscribe now, because this is a long story and there's a great deal more where it came from, and I think you'll want to be around for it. Let me start at the beginning, because none of what happened makes any sense without knowing how I got to that kitchen table in the first place. I grew up in Handsworth, in Birmingham, the son of a toolmaker and a school dinner lady, which meant that from fairly early on, I understood money as something that required close attention, not because we were ever in genuine crisis, but because the margin between comfortable and uncomfortable was never large enough to ignore. My father was a meticulous man with a ledger book, the kind of person who knew to the penny what every week cost and what every week earned, and he passed that particular habit of mind on to me with the same quiet insistence that he passed on everything else, by simply doing it visibly, year after year, until it became the only way I knew how to think about a problem. You write it down, you look at the actual numbers, you don't manage by feeling alone. I went into engineering through an apprenticeship at 17, the kind of route that barely exists anymore, but which suited me perfectly well at the time, learning by doing, working my way up through roles that got progressively more technically demanding, until I landed, in my mid-30s, in a position as a mechanical systems engineer at a manufacturing firm in the West Midlands, where I spent the better part of the next 2 decades. Not glamorous work, not the kind of career that generates interesting dinner party conversation, but solid, skilled, meaningful, in the way that practical things are meaningful, making systems work, fixing what's broken, understanding the relationship between one moving part and the next. I was good at it, and I liked being good at it, which I've always thought is the best possible outcome for how a person spends most of their waking hours. I married Margaret in 1987. We were 27 and 25 respectively, which felt less young at the time than it sounds now, and we set up house in a terrace in Oldbury that we bought with the help of a modest family contribution from her parents and a mortgage that felt eye-watering then and would feel almost quaint by current standards. We had 2 children, Daniel and Suzanne, close enough together in age that the early years of parenting them had a kind of overlapping intensity that Margaret and I still talk about, with a mixture of exhaustion and genuine fondness, the way you talk about something that was genuinely hard and also genuinely irreplaceable. Margaret worked in NHS administration throughout, which meant that between the 2 of us we were contributing to 2 separate pension pots and 2 separate national insurance records, building what we both assumed, with complete confidence, would translate into a comfortable, if not lavish, retirement. We were not, to be clear, naive people. We read the relevant statements when they arrived. We occasionally consulted an independent financial advisor, the sort of conversation that always left me feeling like I'd understood less about my own financial future at the end of it than I had at the beginning, which I now think says something about the nature of financial advice more broadly, rather than anything specific about my own comprehension. We made what felt like reasonable assumptions that most people in our position were making at the same time, that the state pension would provide a meaningful floor, that our workplace pensions would sit comfortably on top of it, and that the combination of the 2 would deliver a retirement that looked, broadly speaking, like a modestly comfortable version of the life we'd been living while working. What we didn't fully account for, what I suspect most people of my generation didn't fully account for, was the compound effect of inflation on fixed retirement income, the particular and sustained explosion in UK housing costs that pushed utility bills, council tax, and general maintenance costs into a completely different category than the one we'd budgeted against, and the creeping reality that 2 people who've planned well can still find themselves, by their mid-60s, looking at a gap between income and actual cost of living that grows wider rather than narrower with each passing year. Margaret died in 2019. Breast cancer, diagnosed late, progressed quickly, and I lost her within 11 months of the diagnosis, which still feels, even now, like the kind of timeline that belongs to someone else's story rather than my own. She was 59 years old. We had, in the ordinary arithmetic of a life, expected decades more. I don't intend to spend a great deal of time on the grief here, because this is not primarily a story about grief, and I think Margaret herself, who had very little patience for dwelling, would have found extended dwelling on her own behalf somewhat irritating. What I will say is that her death changed the financial picture sharply and immediately in ways I hadn't anticipated, partly because the pension arrangements we'd made together were built on assumptions that included both of our incomes for a shared set of expenses, and partly because the house, a semi-detached in a suburb of Wolverhampton we'd moved to when the children were teenagers, cost an amount to maintain, heat, insure, and pay council tax on that made considerably more sense when divided by two than it did when I was doing it alone. I was left with a full-sized family home, a household infrastructure designed for two incomes and a shared life, and a retirement income that I now had to stretch further than it had ever been designed to stretch. The state pension, which I began drawing at 66, came to just over £9,000 annually at the time I started receiving it, the new full state pension, the thing I'd been told for the better part of my working life I was building toward. My workplace pension from the manufacturing firm added another £7,000 or so annually, and Margaret's survivor's benefit from her own NHS scheme contributed a small additional amount. In total, I was drawing somewhere in the region of £17,000 a year before tax, which in the abstract sounds like a number that should work, that should represent the comfortable floor I'd been told to expect. In practice, the mortgage on the house was paid off, which helped, but the heating costs alone on a house that size had risen to something alarming over the previous few winters. The council tax bill had climbed to over £2,000 a year. Insurance on the property and contents ran to another several hundred, and the ordinary business of maintaining a house, repairs, appliances, gutters, the boiler that chose a particularly inconvenient January to start failing, absorbed what remained faster than any ledger calculation I made seemed to properly account for. I was living carefully, more carefully than I'd expected to need to live, in a house that was too large for one person, in a country whose cost of living had moved in a direction that my fixed income was simply not designed to track. I'm not asking for sympathy in saying any of this. I want to be clear about that. I know I'm luckier than many. I know there are people in far more precarious situations than mine, but I'm also interested in honesty, the kind of honest accounting my father taught me to do with a ledger book, and the honest account of my situation by the time I was 67 was that the arrangement I'd been contributing to for 40 years was not delivering what 40 years of contribution had led me to expect. That's not a complaint dressed up as analysis. That's just the arithmetic, written down in plain figures, the way my father taught me. The Philippines entered my thinking through a man named Phil, which I've always found slightly ironic in retrospect, a former colleague from the engineering firm who'd retired 2 years before me, and who had, without making much noise about it, spent his first year of retirement doing something very similar to what I eventually did, just researching quietly, in the corner of the internet where these communities gather, without telling anyone from his former life, because he wasn't sure yet whether it was something he'd actually act on, or just something interesting to know. Phil called me one evening, out of the blue, about 8 months after Margaret had died, and asked whether I'd mind if he came round, because he had something he wanted to show me. This was Phil's way of saying something important was coming. He was not a man who visited unannounced without a reason, so I said yes, told him I'd put the kettle on, and waited. What he brought with him was a spreadsheet, which should surprise no one who worked in engineering for 35 years. He spread it on my kitchen table and walked me through it, the way a person walks a colleague through a technical specification, methodically, without editorializing, just the numbers first and the analysis after. He'd been spending extended periods in a city called Cebu in the Philippines over the previous 18 months, initially as what he described as extended tourism and eventually as something closer to a reconnaissance mission. He'd tracked everything: accommodation, food, transport, healthcare costs, the visa system, utilities, communication, all of it, against what the same life was costing him in Coventry. The comparison was not subtle. It was not a marginal difference. It was the kind of difference that, when you look at it written down in 2 columns side by side, makes you feel briefly as though you've misread something, and then, when you check and realize you haven't, makes you sit down heavily and look at it again. He was living well in Cebu, not extravagantly. He wasn't describing a life of pool villas and restaurant dinners every night. He was describing a life that looked recognizably like a decent, comfortable retirement, a pleasant apartment in a walkable neighborhood, regular good meals, enough left over for the occasional day trip or experience, without the kind of constant mental arithmetic that had become the background noise of my existence in Wolverhampton. And he was doing it on his pension. The whole pension, without the anxious rationing, without looking at the utility bill with a specific kind of dread he'd developed in his first winter after retiring in England. He was doing it because in Cebu, his monthly pension income represented actual financial breathing room rather than a fixed amount to be carefully parceled out against rising costs. I want to pause here for just a second because I know some of what I've just described might be landing close to home for some of you, and I don't want to rush past it. If any part of this is resonating, take a moment, sit with it. There's no need to have an answer right now. But if you're the kind of person who finds these stories useful, who likes hearing how other people actually got through the parts of life that don't come with instructions, I'd really appreciate it if you hit subscribe before we go any further, because there's a lot more of this story left, and honestly, a lot more stories like it waiting after this one. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, not in some abstract algorithm sense, though sure, there's that too, but in a more direct way. It tells me these stories are actually reaching people, actually landing somewhere, and that keeps me motivated to keep telling them honestly instead of dressing them up. I'll be honest, when I first started sharing pieces of my own life like this, I wasn't sure anyone would care, wasn't sure a story about an ordinary person going through an ordinary hard stretch of life would be worth anyone's time when there's no shortage of louder, flashier things competing for attention out there. But it turns out a lot of people are quietly hungry for exactly this, not spectacle, just honesty, just someone willing to say the true, unglamorous parts of a hard chapter out loud instead of skipping straight to the tidy resolution. So, if that's what's kept you listening this far, subscribing is a small thing that means a lot, and it makes sure you don't miss where this story goes, or the ones that come after it. Alright, back to it, because there's a fair bit more to tell, and I don't want to leave you hanging on the part that comes next, which, honestly, is where things really started to shift. I listened to him talk for about 2 hours that evening, asking the kind of questions that the engineer's part of my brain produces automatically when presented with a system it doesn't yet fully understand. What about healthcare? What about the visa situation, the legal framework, the actual practical mechanism for getting money from a British bank to a Philippine one without losing a significant percentage of it to transfer fees? What about the internet? Because I still needed to manage accounts, communicate with Daniel and Suzanne, keep some degree of meaningful contact with a life that wasn't simply going to disappear just because I left. What about isolation? What about crime, which was the first thing most people asked, and often the least nuanced? What about the heat, which I raised not because I was opposed to warmth, but because I was 67 years old and British, and therefore constitutionally uncertain about how my body would respond to sustained tropical temperatures after 6 decades of quite different information? Phil had answers to most of it, real answers, not the vague reassurances of a man who'd made a decision and needed it to have been the right one, but the specific, detailed, verifiable answers of someone who'd actually been tracking the information for a year and a half, and had, in fact, been building toward exactly this conversation. The healthcare question I came back to several times, from different angles, because it was the one that felt most consequential. He walked me through what he'd actually spent on medical care in 18 months in Cebu, which wasn't nothing but which was substantially less than I'd feared and substantially more straightforward than I'd expected. He'd had a consultation with a specialist for a minor cardiac concern, the kind of thing that was eating several weeks of anxiety and an NHS waiting list back in England, and had been seen by a cardiologist within 4 days, privately, for an amount that made me genuinely recalculate everything I thought I understood about what healthcare was supposed to cost relative to quality. I told him I'd think about it. This was true in the sense that I couldn't think about much else for the following 6 weeks, during which I did exactly what my father's ledger book instinct required me to do, and built my own version of the spreadsheet from scratch, using Phil's data as a starting framework, but verifying everything independently through the expat forums, the official government sources on the special resident retirees visa, and a significant number of hours reading the written accounts of British retirees who had made similar moves and documented them in enough detail that I could cross-reference specific costs across different accounts and arrive at something I trusted as a reasonably accurate picture. What the spreadsheet showed me, once I'd built it honestly, was this. My total pension income, all sources combined, covered roughly 3 weeks of my actual cost of living in Wolverhampton before I reached a deficit that I was gradually drawing down from savings to bridge. The same income, transported to the part of the Philippines I was considering, would cover a full year's worth of comfortable living with money left over. Not 3 weeks versus 12 months as a figure of speech or a rough approximation. 3 weeks against 12 months as the actual, written down, line by line, verified output of a careful comparison of 2 real lives in 2 real places on the same fixed income. I sat with that number for a long time. I thought about what my father would have said, looking at a ledger with those 2 figures on facing pages. I thought he would have said it was perfectly obvious what the decision was, and that the only interesting question was what had taken me so long to look at it properly. I told Daniel first, then Suzanne, then Phil, in that order. Daniel's reaction was the most complicated, partly because he is in many ways the most like me, methodical, cautious, inclined to identify the 17 things that could go wrong before he gets to the one thing that might go right. He's 35, works in project management, and has a particular talent for risk assessment that serves him very well professionally and somewhat less well in conversations with his father about life decisions. He listened carefully, asked good questions, and then asked the one question I'd been expecting and had prepared for, which was what I would do if something went medically wrong and he or Suzanne needed to get to me quickly. I walked him through the specific answer, which included the travel insurance, the private international health insurance policy I'd arranged that covered repatriation in genuine emergencies, and the practical reality that a direct flight from Heathrow to Cebu was a manageable journey in the context of an actual serious emergency. He didn't fully come around in that first conversation, but he listened, which felt like enough for a start. Suzanne was quicker to it. She's 33, teaches primary school in Bristol, has a restless curiosity about the world that she's had since she was about 8 years old and started reading travel books the way other children her age were reading adventure fiction. She asked about the food, which was not the question I expected first, and then about the people, and then about whether I'd actually be happy there, by which she meant whether it would be a genuine life rather than just a more affordable version of sitting alone in a house. It was, I thought, the right question, the one that got to something beyond the spreadsheet, and I appreciated her for asking it. I told her honestly that I didn't fully know the answer yet, that I intended to find out, and that finding out felt like the only honest response to a situation where staying put out of fear had begun to feel less like prudence and more like a slow surrender to circumstances I could actually change. She said, "Go, Dad, go and see." And then she asked whether she could come out for a visit within the first few months, and I said she absolutely could, and she did. And that visit turned into something neither of us quite anticipated, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I flew into Manila on a Thursday in November, almost 14 months ago now, connecting on to Cebu that same evening, landing in a city I'd only ever encountered through a spreadsheet and a friend's slightly evangelistic enthusiasm, with 2 large suitcases, a carry-on, and the specific combination of exhaustion and adrenaline that long-haul travel at 68 produces in a body that is no longer 25. Phil met me at the airport, as arranged, and the first thing he said when he saw me was, "Right, give it a week before you decide anything," which I understood to mean that the first impressions would be overwhelming, and that impressions made while overwhelmed were not the ones to build decisions on. He was correct about that. The first week was a great deal of information arriving very quickly. The heat, which was genuinely significant and required a physical and mental adjustment I hadn't quite prepared for, despite being told about it. The traffic in central Cebu, which operates on principles I was not immediately equipped to decode. The sounds and smells and textures of a city that was simultaneously deeply familiar in its rhythms. People working, families eating, shops opening and closing, ordinary daily life happening in all its ordinary daily ways, and completely unlike anything I'd spent 67 years building intuitions about. I kept waiting to feel lost in some definitive sense, to hit a moment of genuine disorientation that would tell me this had been a mistake, and it kept not coming. What came instead was something more like the particular alertness of a person who is paying attention to things rather than moving through them on autopilot, which I realized, with some surprise, I hadn't felt in quite some time. Phil had helped me arrange a furnished apartment in a relatively quiet area of Cebu City, not in the most tourist-heavy district, which was deliberate, close enough to necessary amenities, but residential enough to feel like somewhere people actually lived, rather than somewhere people temporarily passed through. The rent on that apartment, 2 bedrooms, clean, well-maintained, a small balcony, reliable air conditioning, which I want to be honest, is not a luxury in that climate, but a genuine practical necessity, came to somewhere in the region of 18,000 pesos a month, which at the exchange rates I was working with translated to approximately £275. I want to let that sit for a moment, because before I'd done the research, I would have found that figure implausible, and I think it's worth giving people who haven't done the research the same moment of sitting with it that I needed. £275 a month for a clean, comfortable, fully furnished, 2-bedroom apartment in a city with genuine infrastructure, with good transport links, with a range of genuine amenities, not a shack, not a compromise, an apartment I was glad to come home to at the end of a day. The food costs were similarly difficult to absorb initially, not because they were high, but because everything I knew about budgeting for food had been calibrated against British prices, and recalibrating took a few weeks of conscious adjustment. I was eating well, genuinely well, varied and fresh, and often excellent in ways that cooking for one in Wolverhampton had never quite managed to be, spending approximately 8,000 to 10,000 pesos a month on food across all sources, eating out several times a week in small local restaurants of the kind that I suspect don't have Western equivalents at any comparable price point, buying fresh produce at a market a 15-minute walk from the apartment where the quality was notably better than what I'd become accustomed to from a British supermarket, and the price was a fraction of it. The tomatoes alone made me unreasonably emotional the first time I bought them, which I acknowledge is a very particular kind of retired Englishman's problem, but which I maintain is a genuine observation about what access to actual fresh produce does for the experience of daily cooking. My total monthly expenditure in those first few months, tracking it carefully as I'd committed to doing, ran to somewhere between 35 and 40,000 pesos, which at prevailing rates translated to roughly 530 to 600 pounds a month, all in, including the rent, the food, the transport, the internet, the entertainment, the occasional day trip or experience, and a reasonable contingency buffer. My total pension income converted to roughly £1,100 a month at the exchange rates I was working with, which meant I was not just covering my costs, but genuinely living within my income with several £100s a month to spare, an experience so profoundly foreign to my previous 2 years of retirement in England that I kept expecting to find the error in the calculation. There was no error. I checked it multiple times, with the same compulsion that makes engineers check structural calculations against 3 different methods before signing off, and the answer was the same each time. I was living comfortably, genuinely comfortably, on income that had been covering barely 3 weeks of my previous life, and the difference was not about sacrifice or compromise. It was simply about where on the planet the same money was asked to do its work. The visa process was smoother than I'd feared, partly because Phil had walked me through it in enough detail that I arrived with the right documentation already organized, and partly because the special resident retirees visa system in the Philippines has been, whatever its other complexities, genuinely designed with foreign retirees in mind in a way that the administrative experience of the process somewhat reflects. I'm not going to suggest it was entirely without moments of bureaucratic friction, because that would be dishonest, but the overall experience of formalizing my right to be there was manageable in a way that felt proportionate to the outcome it produced, which was legal residency in a country I intended to make my actual home rather than just an extended holiday. The first real test came about 6 weeks in, when I developed what turned out to be a fairly significant chest infection, the kind that in my experience of dealing with such things in England would have involved several days of hoping it resolved on its own. A visit to a GP surgery, where I'd be seen by someone I'd never met in a 15-minute appointment, that would result in a prescription I'd then queue for at the pharmacy and be slightly nervous about filling because the antibiotics seemed perhaps stronger than strictly warranted. What happened instead was that Phil, who by this point had become something close to a local guide, in addition to a friend, took me to a private clinic he'd been using for 18 months, where I was seen by a doctor within 30 minutes of arriving, a thorough consultation that ran to the better part of 45 minutes and involved the kind of unhurried, genuine inquiry into what was happening with my respiratory system that I last remember experiencing from a doctor sometime in the early 1990s, and was prescribed antibiotics and given detailed instructions about what to watch for if the infection progressed. The total cost of the consultation, the prescription, and a follow-up appointment to confirm resolution was less than 2,000 pesos, less than £30. I cleared the infection within 10 days and went back to the follow-up feeling, among other things, like I'd just had a demonstration that the healthcare concern, while legitimate to raise, was considerably more manageable in practice than it was in theory. I called Daniel with the full account of it afterward, as I'd committed to doing with anything medical that happened, so he wouldn't get information second-hand and fill in the gaps with his own worst-case thinking. He was quiet for a moment after I described the cost, and then he said, £30. For the whole thing, and I confirmed that yes, for the whole thing, and he said nothing for a couple of seconds, and then said that he'd paid £32 just for the prescription the last time he'd had bronchitis, and had seen someone on a video call for 8 minutes. I wasn't trying to make a point. I was simply reporting accurately, but the point seemed to make itself. Suzanne came out in February, as she'd promised, and stayed for 2 weeks, which was long enough for her to move past the initial phase of enthusiastic tourism and into something more like genuine assessment of what my daily life actually looked like. She came with me to the market on the second morning, and I watched her doing the same conversion arithmetic in her head that I'd done when I first arrived, looking at a pile of fresh mangoes, and then at the price, and then at the mangoes again, with an expression I recognized as the same one I'd worn. She met Phil, who spent an evening cooking for all three of us at his apartment, and describing, with his characteristic spreadsheet precision, exactly how his financial situation had changed since making the move. Real numbers, real comparisons, the kind of honest accounting that lands differently than any amount of vague assurance about things being much cheaper. She walked the city with me several times, watched how I navigated it, watched what had become familiar and routine, saw for herself that the isolation she'd been gently worried about was not, in fact, the dominant experience I was having. What she also saw, and what I think was at least as important to her as any of the practical evidence, was that I was different than I'd been in Wolverhampton. Not dramatically, not in any way that would make a good story, just in the particular quality of engagement that a person has when they're genuinely present in their life, rather than just maintaining the shape of one. I'd been maintaining the shape of a life in Wolverhampton for the better part of 2 years after Margaret died, going through routines that had been built around 2 people and now existed for 1, doing the shopping and the cooking and the maintenance and the paying of bills with the mechanical competence of someone who knows how to do all the tasks, but has lost the sense of what the tasks are in service of. Here I was actually curious about the day. What was at the market? Whether Phil wanted to do the trip to the Oslob whale sharks he'd been planning. Whether the cafe run by a woman named Aling Nenna, a formidably energetic woman of about 60, who had decided, within my first 2 weeks of visiting her establishment, that I was a person who needed more vegetables in my diet and had taken it upon herself to add an additional dish to whatever I ordered without altering the price. Whether Aling Nenna's cafe would have the particularly good version of the pork sinigang that she made on days when she was in a generous mood, which you could tell by whether the radio in the back was playing the particular station she preferred. Suzanne had dinner at Aling Nenna's cafe twice during her visit, and by the second time, Aling Nenna had absorbed her into the same general system of unsolicited vegetable addition and gentle maternal authority that she'd applied to me. And Suzanne seemed to find this approximately as funny and touching as I had, which told me something about what my daughter had seen that she perhaps hadn't expected to see, which was not her father managing a diminished life with stoic competence, but her father living an actual life, with actual people in it. People who had opinions about his vegetable intake and who had made a place for him in the texture of their daily routines without being asked to. On her last evening, Suzanne and I sat on the balcony of my apartment in the dark, which is something I do most evenings because the air in the later hours is more manageable than the mid-afternoon, and there is a particular quality of sound and light in a Filipino city after 9 at night that I find genuinely pleasant. The distant sound of karaoke from somewhere several blocks away, which is a constant and which I have come to regard with a kind of affection I would not have predicted. The occasional motorbike, the faint sound of families through open windows going about the end of their evenings. Suzanne had a glass of the local rum, which she'd been working up to trying for 3 days, on the grounds that she generally preferred wine, but was in a spirit of experimentation. And she said, after sitting quietly for a while, "I came here expecting to be worried, Dad. I'm not worried at all. I'm almost envious." I told her almost was a perfectly reasonable place to land after 2 weeks, and she laughed and said she might need to come back for a longer visit to get past the almost, and I told her the second bedroom was hers whenever she needed it. Daniel has not yet visited. This is not from lack of invitation or from any settled antagonism to the idea. It's more that Daniel processes things slowly, which is not a criticism. I process things slowly too. It's a family trait that has served both of us well in engineering and project management, and somewhat less efficiently in the domain of personal decisions. He and I speak every Sunday, which we started doing in the first weeks after I arrived, and have maintained without ever formally agreeing to maintain it. It simply happened, and then continued happening. An hour, or sometimes more, of genuine conversation, not the checking in out of duty calls that characterized the first year after his mother died, but actual conversation about what I'd done in the week, about what he was dealing with at work, about the news, about things we were reading, about the ongoing and apparently irresolvable question of whether Birmingham City will ever again be the club that his grandfather took him to watch as a child, and which I am too attached to by family sentiment to be entirely rational about. He asks specific questions now, about Ellingnenna, about whether Phil and I had done the day trip to Moalbol that we'd been planning, about the infrastructure project I'd started helping with informally, a local community organization that was working on a drainage improvement scheme for a neighborhood that flooded badly in heavy rain, and which had somehow become aware that there was a retired mechanical engineer living nearby, and asked, through the most indirect possible series of connections, whether I might be interested in looking at some plans. That last thing happened through a man named Rodrigo, who I met because he was a regular at a small chess club that met on Saturday mornings in the covered area outside a shopping mall, which is a context that tells you something useful about how things happen in a community like this, not through formal networking or deliberate construction of social infrastructure, but through the kind of casual, overlapping proximity that produces connections more naturally than anything you'd design on purpose. Rodrigo is a civil engineer, semi-retired, 46 years in public works, and we found ourselves over several Saturdays getting into the kind of technical conversation that I hadn't had with genuine engagement since I'd left the manufacturing firm. He mentioned the drainage problem almost as an aside, not expecting anything, just describing something his former colleagues were struggling with, and I found myself the following week thinking about it in the way you think about a problem that has properly gotten into you, waking up in the morning with a different angle on it, making notes on the back of an envelope, the way I used to do when a system at the firm had an inefficiency I couldn't quite yet identify the source of. I told Rodrigo at the following Saturday's chess game that I might have some thoughts, which was an understatement, because I'd filled half a notebook, and he looked at me with an expression I recognized as the look of a professional recognizing something of practical value rather than just polite interest, and arranged for me to meet the people at the community organization the following week. It has since grown, in the way informal things sometimes grow when the problem is real and the interest is genuine, into something that takes up 2 to 3 days of my week, and which represents, without any planning or intention, the closest thing I've had to genuinely purposeful daily work since I retired, the kind of engagement that makes the days feel properly used rather than simply passed. Margaret would have had a specific opinion about this, which is that I was always most myself when there was a system in front of me that needed to work properly and currently didn't, and that the best possible outcome for my retirement was always going to be one that found me elbow deep in an engineering problem rather than putting around a garden or pursuing some leisure activity I'd never actually wanted to pursue but felt I was supposed to want. She was right about this, as she was right about a great number of things that I occasionally acknowledged during her lifetime, and acknowledge more comprehensively now. The fact that the engineering problem is a drainage scheme in a Philippine neighborhood rather than a municipal infrastructure project in the West Midlands matters very little to the specific satisfaction of working out why water is going somewhere it shouldn't, and figuring out how to redirect it somewhere it should. I have been asked many times since I started being open about this move by friends from the engineering firm who track me down on various platforms, by distant family members who've heard through the network of family communication that Gerald has done something unexpected, by complete strangers in the online communities where these conversations happen, whether I'm lonely. It's the question that comes up most consistently, the one that people seem most concerned about, and I want to answer it honestly because I think it deserves an honest answer, rather than the kind of reflexive reassurance that would be easier to offer but less useful. The honest answer is that I have been lonely, occasionally, since arriving here, in the way that I think anyone who has lost their partner of 32 years is going to be lonely in any location, because that particular loneliness is not a function of geography. It's a function of absence, of the particular person being gone, and it comes and goes according to its own schedule, entirely regardless of what country you're in or how many people are around you. There have been evenings on the balcony where I've thought about Margaret with a directness and a weight that no amount of pleasant surroundings could make lighter, where the specific memory of her voice or the particular way she had of expressing an opinion she'd fully formed but was still refining mid-sentence has arrived with the kind of clarity that almost feels like presence and then, emphatically, isn't. But the loneliness of isolation, the loneliness of a person whose days have contracted to the point where there is nobody to talk to who knows them, nobody who notices or would notice their absence, nobody who expects anything from them or has any genuine investment in how their week has gone. That loneliness, the loneliness I'd been quietly managing in Wolverhampton for over a year before Phil came round with his spreadsheet, is largely absent. Aling Nena notices if I don't come in by Thursday. Rodrigo sends a message on Friday afternoons if I haven't been in touch about Saturday's game, not because he's monitoring me, but because it has simply become expected that I'll be there. A normal expectation between two people who have become, without making a ceremony of it, friends. The people at the community organization treat my input with a seriousness that I find simultaneously slightly overwhelming and genuinely sustaining. The particular quality of being seen as useful, as someone whose specific knowledge and experience matters, that I hadn't expected to find here, and which turned out to be more important than the spreadsheet could measure. I had a conversation with Phil, about 3 months into my time here, that I've thought about often since. We were sitting in Aling Nena's cafe, eating, both of us having been assigned more vegetables than we'd technically ordered, and I said to him, out of nowhere in particular, that I felt slightly guilty. He looked at me with genuine curiosity and asked what I felt guilty about. I said I wasn't entirely sure, that it was something like survivor's guilt, but for a system rather than a person, a sense that the situation I'd found myself in, where a lifetime of contribution to a safety net produced an outcome that the safety net was supposed to prevent, and that the escape from that outcome had required knowledge and mobility that not everyone has access to, felt like something I should be more troubled by than I was on any given Tuesday. Phil considered this for a long time, the way Phil considers most things, methodically, from several angles, before he said that feeling troubled by an unjust system and taking the most sensible available route through it weren't mutually exclusive, and that the way he thought about it was that talking about it honestly was the useful version of the guilt, the version that might actually be worth something to someone else trying to think through the same problem, whereas suffering unnecessarily in Coventry would be the useless version, and that he'd long since decided he preferred the useful version. I think about that framing often, which is why I'm telling this story as directly as I'm telling it, because I think the arithmetic should be part of a conversation, rather than something each person works out privately in the corner of the internet, before keeping it quietly to themselves. 40 years of national insurance contributions, 40 years of income tax, a pension that covers 3 weeks of the life it was designed to support, and 1,000 miles away, quite literally, the same pension covering a full year of a life that is not a diminished version of anything, that is not a retreat or a compromise, that is simply a life, properly lived, within the actual resources available for living it. Daniel called me on a Sunday 3 months ago, same as usual, and about 40 minutes into the call, after we'd covered Birmingham City's latest disappointment, and the infrastructure project, and the chess club, and Aling Nena's opinion of my current vegetable intake, he said, almost as an aside, that he'd been looking at flights to Cebu, not announcing a decision, just mentioning a thing he'd done. I said nothing for a moment, because I know how Daniel communicates, and I understood that saying too much at that point would be worse than saying too little. I just said that would be good, Whenever he was ready, the second bedroom had a decent mattress and a good fan and a view of the street that he might find interesting. And he said right, and then we talked about something else entirely, and I didn't bring it up again, and neither did he. And 2 weeks later he sent me a message with a screenshot of a booking confirmation for August. No comment attached, just the screenshot. I didn't reply immediately. I made a cup of tea, which is, whatever else changes, a constant, and I sat on the balcony in the early evening air, with the distant karaoke and the motorbikes, and the sound of Alingnena's neighborhood doing what it does in the evenings, and I thought about my father's ledger book, and what he would have made of the final figures, and about Margaret, who would have been here herself if the world had gone differently, who would have had very detailed and specific opinions about every aspect of the apartment, and would have reorganized the kitchen within a week of arriving, and would have been on first-name terms with every person in a 4-block radius by the end of the second week, because that was the particular kind of person she was, and the particular thing about her that I miss most consistently, and the thing I see reflected in the general quality of warmth I've found in the people around me here, enough to feel like recognition rather than replacement, which is the only form it could honestly take. If you made it this far, thank you, genuinely, because I know these aren't short stories, and I know your time is worth something, so the fact that you stayed with this one all the way through means more to me than I think you probably realize. If it gave you anything at all, a little hope, a little perspective, maybe just the sense that you're not the only one who's felt some version of what I described, I'd be grateful if you hit subscribe before you go, because there's more where this came from, and I try to tell each one as honestly as I told this one, doubts and false starts included, not just the parts that make for a tidy ending. This channel exists because I think there aren't enough places where people talk plainly about the hard, quiet stretches of life without rushing to wrap them up in a bow, and I'd like to keep building that here with you if you're willing to stick around for it. So go ahead, hit that button, and I'll see you in the next one, where I promise there's another story worth your time waiting.